October. And again, this is our second last lecture, so we've got our last one on our first Saturday of December. So I'll hand over to Ron to introduce our speaker.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and as Rob said, welcome to our November lecture. The title of today's lecture is Frederick Whirlpool VC, the first Victoria Cross presented in Australia, and it will be presented by Lt-Col Rowan Tracey, LLB, VA, retired. Rowan graduated from the Royal Military College and then spent 23 years in the Australian Regular Army, and during that time he commanded the Papua New Guinea Defence Procurement Agency, and this developed his interest in military history and World War II campaigns in particular. And so he's written extensively on the New Guinea campaign and its higher command aspects. Rowan has also been a trek leader in taking groups over the Kakata Trail and describing the battlefield history in very practical terms. His talk today is on Frederick Whirlpool VC, the first Victoria Cross winner where the medal was presented to him in Australia. And it's not, whilst Whirlpool is the central character, it's not just about Whirlpool alone, but Rowan also talks about those British ex-soldiers and sailors who emigrated to Australia in the 19th century to settle and contribute to the life and development of our country. For many, this was done whilst dealing with their own demons and disabilities as a result of their service to the Crown. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Rowan Tracey to the podium.
Thanks very much, Ron. I guess my lecture in some ways comes a little bit out of left field because it's something that most of you are familiar with in the sense of the attention of most military historians. It starts mainly talking about, as Ron was saying, 19th century colonial military immigrants coming to Australia and the contribution that they made to Australia. So some of you will be very familiar with this photograph, if not the photograph, the area. Of course, this is Victoria Barracks here in Sydney, in Paddington, and it's you can see the edge of the eastern block to the left. It's described as the cricket ground because there was no, at that time there was no road leading up to that block I was just talking about, and it's under the original officers' mess where there's an escarpment and gardens to one side. So the date here is the 4th of December 1901, and it's the presentation ceremony of the Victoria Cross awarded to Captain Neville Reginald House, and it was made by the Lieutenant Governor of New South Wales, Sir Frederick Daly. There's no, I didn't find any reason why the Governor didn't do it himself, but I assume he was absent from Sydney on that day because for such an august function, the Governor would normally be expected to have attended. And as I said, it is on what they described in the press at the time as the cricket ground. 4th of December 1901, represented there were the artillery units, both field and garrison, detachments from the 1st, 2nd, 5th, 6th and 7th Regiment Army Medical Corps, because of course that was House's corps, and a naval brigade. And so on that day there was about 400 troops present, so quite significant, and a crowd of between 700 and 800. So, House on that day, the photograph on the left is a studio portrait, but the one on the right, which is really in the same uniform, was taken on that day, on the 4th of December. Remembering now that it's almost 12 months since Federation when he's receiving this, so this is quite a long time after he had actually won the Victoria Cross. He was aged 37. He wasn't an Australian by birth. He was a member of the New South Wales Medical Corps in the Boer War, and in an action on the 24th of July 1900, under heavy fire, House rescued a wounded trumpeter who had fallen from his horse near Redfort in the Orange Free State. As a non-combatant at the time, Medical Corps, he was in imminent danger. He was later captured by the Boers in another action, and then following that he returned to Australia. At the outbreak of World War I, he joined the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force that occupied German New Guinea. After coming back to Australia, he was hoping to get on a boat to Gallipoli, but that didn't happen immediately. In fact, by petty jealousies within his corps, he was sidelined, and he actually got a train down to Melbourne to speak to the hierarchy to try and get to Gallipoli, which eventually he did. He is recognised for developing the Australian Medical Corps into a professional service after witnessing the rudimentary support provided by the British at Gallipoli. In 1917 he was knighted and promoted to Major General. Later he became a minister in the Commonwealth Parliament. There's a little bit of trivia regarding the Victoria Cross. A Tasmanian, Lieutenant Guy Willie from the Tasmanian Imperial Bushmen, on an action later than House's on the 1st of September 1900, was awarded the Victoria Cross, and he was the first Australian-born soldier to be presented with the Victoria Cross, and that was presented to him by, earlier than the occasion we talked about at Victoria Barracks, presented by King Edward VII at St James Palace on the 25th of July 1901. And another bit of trivia, a fellow soldier in the same unit, Trooper John Bisdee, with Willie, also won a Victorian Cross on the same day, and his Victoria Cross was gazetted first. Now, a very grainy picture, but that is a drawing by an artist called Fred Least. Now, at the outbreak of World War I, Least was in London. He'd been working as an artist there, and he eventually became, and where you might be familiar with him, he became one of the Australian official war artists in the First World War. So you'll find some of his artwork at the Australian War Memorial. And of interest here are the two white bearded gentlemen who, after House had received his Victoria Cross and was pinned on his breast, received what was described as hearty congratulations from these two white bearded gentlemen. Some of you who are familiar with the Victoria Barracks Museum would know something of what I'm about to say. The first one was Captain Alfred Heathcote, who was later the 60th Rifles, and the second white-bearded gentleman was Sergeant John Patton, later the 93rd Foot. Each old soldier wore their Victoria Cross together with Crimean and Mutiny medals. Both earned Victoria Crosses during the Indian Mutiny by election of their unit, either by the unit officers or the NCOs respectively, and later migrated to New South Wales. Heathcote was appointed a captain in the New South Wales Infantry, and he lived on site in Victoria Barracks with his wife until his unit was disbanded. His medals, sword, and a number of his other possessions are held by the Victoria Barracks Museum. Ron was telling me the other day that his Victoria Cross is either about to become on display there or already is. And obviously security is a very big item, and I'll talk about that later in the address, about the value of that Victoria Cross, for example. Peyton, on the other hand, arrived in New South Wales in 1861. He joined the prison service there, serving at Port Macquarie and Deniliquin, before being appointed Governor of the Berrima and later the Goulburn Jail. So quite important roles in the New South Wales colony. So I'm not going to take issue with Ron because what he would say is always right, but as far as the Victoria Cross is concerned and their presentations in Australia, and I'll touch on this with Whirlpool a bit later. The first presentations of the Victoria Crosses in Australia was made in March 1858 to two soldiers. They're British soldiers who were then serving with the 77th Regiment on tour of duty in Sydney. And they were earned during the Crimean War, and their VCs were sent to their unit for presentation. So they were not public awards, they were done just within their unit, and I assume their CO presented those two Victoria Crosses to them. The two white-bearded veterans here in the picture were members of a continuous stream of red-coated immigrants to Australia who helped to populate the country from first settlement until World War I. Historian Craig Wilcox continues, "These old soldiers, as veterans of the red-coated rank and file were commonly called, were the collective ancestors of the returned men of the 20th century. Just as their successors would do, they remembered great battles they'd fought in, and they came together to commemorate them. Likewise, some received pensions and some free land. Often they took government jobs as policemen or other figures in authority. If they were drinkers, their drinking helped maintain the old soldiers' reputation as habitual sots. As they aged, they came to receive applause from a community quietly proud of them and the link they offered to an heroic past. A link that helped make everyone the inheritors of Waterloo, the charge of the Light Brigade and the defence of Rorke's Drift." Not that it is well remembered today, but these immigrants with a military background came from a number of sources. Firstly, British soldiers came to Australia to serve in regiments on garrison duty from 1788 to 1870. This was at the expense of British taxpayers, and many stayed on legitimately or as deserters when their units departed Australia for a new location. Between 1839 and 1851, more than 2,000 were assessed as doing so. Next, after discharge overseas, veterans came to Australia individually or with their wives and children. On occasion, an army pension was paid for their passage. In the early 1830s, 4,500 pensioners were able to trade their allowances for a lump sum and free passage to one of Britain's colonies. Another group arrived with units intended to settle Australia as much as to protect it. The New South Wales Corps was, in a sense, the first of these. Hundreds of its men married locally and formed into a veteran company, given land and eventually discharged. Others supervised teams of convicts on public works projects, such as the construction of the Tasmanian garrison town of Oakland, before being discharged and becoming settlers. In the 1850s and 1860s came the enrolled pensioners, former soldiers now in middle age who were given a musket and a blue coat as guards on convict ships to form a military reserve in the Australian colonies. More than 1,000 were sent to Western Australia and Tasmania, founding villages, supervising convicts, police work and farming. Some enlisted to go to the goldfields in Victoria to support the police during the rowdy prelude to Eureka. In the 1820s, 3 veteran companies formed in Great Britain from old soldiers who had fought against Napoleon at Waterloo. They had fallen on hard times and were given a better opportunity in life by moving to Australia. Irrespective of their varying backgrounds, most veteran immigrants were attracted to the Australian colonies by the chance of improved circumstances, better than they could expect in Britain. Often this would include free land. Overall, they made a significant contribution to the colony they settled in. Old soldiers could also provide experience and knowledge in the defence of their newly adopted colonies. This was the case in 1863 when some joined the 4 battalions raised in Victoria to suppress Maori resistance in New Zealand. Of interest here is the collective responsibility taken by the Australian colonies to support their fellow colony in New Zealand with manpower, war hardware and stores. Also, there was consideration and support given for the welfare of families left in Australia after the departure of the men for service in New Zealand. And in 1885, when New South Wales offered to send a battalion of infantry and some artillery to assist the British in the Sudan, of the soldiers enlisted, 1 in 5 had previous military experience, and there was a far greater proportion in the officers who departed for the Sudan. To better appreciate the broader contribution made by veteran immigrants to Australia, one has to understand the level of migration to Australia in the first half of the 19th century. For that, Geoffrey Blaney's Tyranny of Distance is a good resource. If Australia was situated as close as North America was to Europe, he estimated that it would be, by 1850, have twice the population it did. Instead, the cost and length of the voyage to Australia meant that Australia was not a preferred destination for immigrants. Thus, the veteran community in Australia brought important and needed skills to the infant colonies that were short of immigrants. Many veterans had come from Ireland. This was not surprising, as both the British Army and the East India Company Army were replete with Irishmen. Such an Irishman, which the second part of this presentation is about, was Frederick Whirlpool. Born Humphrey James in 1831 in County Carlow in Ireland, he was well educated at the local institute in Dundalk. After working as a clerk, he decided to enlist in the Honourable East India Company Army in 1854. 2 reasons for choosing the Honourable East India Company Army rather than the British Army may have been better conditions offered there, and perhaps it was easier to join with less questions about people's backgrounds asked. In so doing, he changed his name to Frederick Whirlpool. This was not unusual at the time, but he seemed to want to make a clean break from his past. One reason given for his attitude was unhappiness with his family, particularly his overbearing father. After training at Worley Depot in Essex, he sailed for Bombay in November 1854, never to return to his homeland. And you just should be aware, if any of you have researched anything about Whirlpool, you'll see there's quite a confusion about what his name was, because there was some speculation there, but he was born Humphrey James, as I said, and he changed his name to Frederick Whirlpool when he enlisted. As a member of the 3rd Bombay European Regiment, Private Whirlpool became an assistant school teacher in the Poona cantonment. His education and training were valued, and he was able to assist his fellow soldiers to obtain a basic education. So you can see the 2 circles there. So he's landed in Bombay, and you can see Poona a bit to the southeast there, and where his future actions would be on the Gangetic Plain are further north there in the 2nd circle. At the time Whirlpool enlisted, the Crimean War was underway, and that went between 1853 and 1856, as you probably know. It was in this conflict that the first Victoria Crosses were awarded. Peace for Great Britain did not last long when a mutiny of sepoys broke out against the British East India Company at Meerut on the 10th of May 1857. Mutinies and rebellions extended in the upper Gangetic Plain and central India. Whirlpool's unit was not involved in the early fighting, but at the end of the year it was sent to reinforce the central India Field Force. His time in the classroom was decisively over. with his unit carrying out an attack on Jhansi on the 3rd of April 1858. Under heavy fire from the fort wall, because it was a fortress town, Whirlpool carried to safety several wounded and dead soldiers on at least 2 occasions. Once again, on the 2nd of May 1858, Whirlpool distinguished himself during the assault on the village of Lahari. He rushed forward to protect a former fallen officer, Lieutenant F.C. Don, who was dangerously wounded. Now, I just take your attention to this photo, the photo of a drawing, because this is by a chap called Monty Webb, and maybe somebody can help me after the lecture, because Monty Webb was quite a famous artist. He used to do comics, and he did a number he had some characters like a Superman, but he also did a number on history things like Ned Kelly and other things like that. He ended up he had a museum in Sydney, and then he opened one up near Williamtown, north of Newcastle, where he did. And he obviously is dead now, but he did 3 sketches on Whirlpool, and this is one of them. There are no photographs, of course, of Whirlpool, so if you're asking me for something like that, there are none, but this is as close as you can get. One of the things with what Monty Webb was, though, his accuracy for detail. I don't know whether you've seen his books, but he did a book on colonial uniforms, obviously pre-Federation, which is really something very important in its own right. But his work for detail of uniforms and that sort of thing was unchallenged. And just between his legs, you can see Don there, who's fallen down there, and he's protecting him. And you can see this was a narrow walkway. It's described as only being 4 abreast, so he's accurately portrayed that as well. But not easy to fight with a bayonet and a rifle in that sort of environment. But that's exactly what Whirlpool did. By protecting Don, Whirlpool set a brave example to his comrades, who responded by retrieving the situation and capturing the village. The fighting in a passageway, allowing only 4 abreast, was difficult, particularly with a rifle and bayonet. Whirlpool's gallantry left him with 17 horrific wounds to his head and neck, one of which was described as nearly severing his head from his body. It was for these 2 actions that Whirlpool was awarded the Victoria Cross, so it's a combination of both the earlier battle that he was involved in and then the one at Jhansi. Whirlpool was carried to a hospital at Jhansi, where he was operated on for a serious fracture of the skull. Bone fragments were removed and a silver plate was affixed to close the gap. And some of you might also know that in history, anaesthetics hadn't been developed at that time. So he's under some very severe operation. His wounds were cleansed and dressings changed regularly. The surgery did not cause major infection, and Whirlpool was moved to Poona, so back to where he started from, where after 5 months he was discharged from the army on the 2nd of February 1859, unfit for further active service. And just in the context of when this happened, you should note, of course, only 5 years prior, during the Crimean War, Florence Nightingale highlighted the high death rates of British soldiers caused by poor hygiene and health standards. The other thing worth noting is that at the time, there were no posthumous VCs, so if Whirlpool had died, we wouldn't really know anything about him at all today. Whirlpool's commanding general at Jhansi, Sir Hugh Rose, regarded him as the bravest soldier in his force. He personally increased Whirlpool's pension from 9pence a day to 1 shilling and 3pence, hoping that his wounds would not prevent him from adding to his 15 pence, which at the time gave him £22.10 per annum. Whirlpool decided that his future lay in the colony of Victoria rather than in Great Britain, arriving there in 1859. Of course, there would have been prominence of Victoria with the goldfields having opened up by then. He found work as a teacher in Melbourne and joined the Hawthorn and Kew Volunteer Rifle Regiment. But under another name, he called himself then Frederick Humphrey James. Nevertheless, his background was uncovered by an alert drill instructor, NCO, which led to a public conferral of his medal. How are we going, Ronus? Okay. Whirlpool's the occasion to present Whirlpool with his Victoria Cross was the celebration of the Queen's birthday on the 20th of June 1861. Her Majesty had required that the presentation be made on a suitable public and formal occasion. The venue chosen for the parade was open land between the Sandridge Battery and Butt Station on the St Kilda railway line. Today this area of Melbourne is known as Middle Park. It was reported that 14,000 people were present at the parade, including 2,000 regular and volunteer soldiers from the Melbourne area. Following the arrival of the Governor, Sir Henry Barclay, KCB, an inspection march past and advance in review order took place. A three-sided square was then formed and the Governor's wife, Lady Barclay, was ushered forward to bestow the Victoria Cross on Private Whirlpool. What followed was reported in a local newspaper. Lady Barclay addressed the following few and graceful words to the hero. Quote, "Private Whirlpool, had you returned to England after your gallant services in India, the value of this cross, which you have so nobly won, would doubtless have been immeasurably enhanced by your receiving it at the hands of your Queen. As, however, you have chosen this country for your home and joined the ranks of its defenders, the honour of presenting it devolves today on me, and I cannot but feel doubly proud that on this first occasion on which the highest distinction British fellow can attain is bestowed in Australia, I should have to affix it to a volunteer uniform, and in presence of comrades so capable of appreciating your heroic exploits." End quote. Her Ladyship then made a few steps forward to the gallant soldier and affixed the cross on his left breast. He raised his hat and said a few words in reply. 3 cheers were given with hearty emphasis, the cavalry waving their swords and every volunteer raising his hat. After the ceremony, attempts were made in the Victorian Parliament to secure Whirlpool employment in a suitable position, such as the police force, that he was now unfit for active bodily occupations. This did not eventuate, and Whirlpool left for Tasmania late in 1861 to work as a surveyor's labourer for 8 months prior to departing by ship for Sydney on the 4th of September 1862. On the 22nd of September 1862, Whirlpool joined the New South Wales Police Force, but was dismissed at Wagga Wagga on the 10th of June 1863 for disorderly behaviour and alcohol abuse. At this time, Whirlpool had placed his Victoria Cross and campaign medal in the pension office in Sydney for safekeeping. Following training, Whirlpool joined the New South Wales Education Authority as a teacher, so he was back to what he was doing in the military. He taught at a school near Wiseman's Ferry, but was dismissed after a bout of drinking at the local hotel. A similar fate awaited him after he moved to Pitt Town. He was arrested in 1870, 1873 and 1881 for drunkenness. talking about Whirlpool's arrest for drunkenness, and on each occasion he was picking up his quarterly pension in Windsor. He remained in the Pitt Town area and later moved onto the property of a friend, a local storekeeper by the name of John Dick Smith. The intense savagery and killing Whirlpool had experienced in northern India over several weeks did not only leave him with severe physical scarring. He was also scarred mentally, and today this is known as post-traumatic stress disorder. As was normal at the time, he received no treatment for his mental condition, and alcohol provided one means of escaping his recurring trauma. The receipt of a small pension was all that soldiers of Whirlpool's day expected after discharge. They had community support for their deeds on the battlefield, but Whirlpool kept his service record a secret, and even when it may have saved his employment. He lived as a recluse in a slab hut at McGrath's Hill near Windsor until his death in 1899. His only outside contact was Smith, whose assistant carried supplies to him. Whirlpool had no wish to be linked to his heroic past, and the parsimonious nature of his existence was shown by the £160 he left in a savings bank account. I should note here that on top of his pension, which I mentioned earlier, he also received a £10 annuity for his Victoria Cross. Smith was the only mourner at Whirlpool's funeral, alongside a reverend and two undertakers. He was buried at Windsor in an unmarked grave in the Presbyterian Cemetery, and is commemorated by a plaque at the New South Wales Garden of Remembrance at Lidcombe. I know recently there have been some attempts to discover where his grave was, but from knowledge I can gather is that there's been no identification of that gravesite. Whirlpool died interstate, and his estate was divided in equal parts to his surviving siblings. His Victoria Cross went to a brother, and his Indian Mutiny medal to a sister. Living a long way apart though. I think that brother was living in America and the sister was in England. But even at the time, they were hoping to get at least a photograph of him, because he was older and they'd never even seen his face. His family didn't even know what he looked like. By the 1950s, the Victoria Cross was in the hands of a medal dealer in London, who sold it to a collector by the name of Dennis Kroll in 1964 for £550. Just take that in, £550 in 1964. Kroll offered the medal to the Australian War Memorial, but was turned down because Whirlpool was not, in their view, he was not Australian enough. The British origins of the Australian nation were regarded as remote or inconvenient to deal with at the time. So, and this was highlighted by a veteran journalist in Canberra in a number of articles in the Canberra Times. His name was Frank Cranston. After Kroll died, his widow loaned the medal to the Mitchell Library here in Sydney, so it was there for some time. Fortunately for the Australian public, a curator of the Australian War Memorial, and his name was Peter Burnesh, you might have heard of him, recognised the significance of the Victoria Cross, as obviously Kroll had himself. The importance of the colonial period to Australia, and which was what I've been talking about today, and that Whirlpool was Australian. The myopia of the Australian War Memorial was lifted, and it was given a second opportunity to acquire the medal. In October 1983, Emily Kroll presented the Victoria Cross to the Australian War Memorial on permanent loan. It was then able to take its place alongside those of other Australians decorated with the highest award for gallantry. As a resident of Australia, he had received his award in an Australian uniform even if he hadn't earned it in an Australian unit. Something now for those in the audience who might describe themselves as numismatists or fallerists. As a footnote here, the availability and value of medals of this kind are worth considering. Frederick Whirlpool's Indian Mutiny medal, which was considered irretrievably lost for a very long period, turned up, and on the 12th of November 2020 it was sold at auction, obviously not with the Victoria Cross. It was sold on its own for £5,500, $9,600 in London. That was in 2020. And what of the value of Frederick Whirlpool's Victoria Cross? A Victoria Cross from the Indian Mutiny was sold in London just last year, in October 2022. Admittedly, it was slightly rarer than Whirlpool's, as it was a civilian Victoria Cross, but it had an estimated value of between £300,000 and £400,000. The previous record for the Victoria Cross, though, was stood at £750,000. So what happened to this other Victoria Cross, the civilian Victoria Cross? A collector paid £930,000, which in Australia is $1.64 million, once the buyer's premium was added to the Victoria Cross. So, as I mentioned before about the Victoria Cross that may be very soon shown at the Victoria Barracks Museum, it's not inconsiderable to have really excessive, or that's what's needed, security arrangements to show it there. So, it's a good job for all of us that the Australian War Memorial had a change of heart and now it is on display. I've just mentioned there a couple of the sources, certainly not the only sources that I've used, but if for further reading, if any of you want to pursue that, you'll be very familiar with Stuart Braga's book there, Anzac Doctor, that's quite easy to find. Craig Wilcox, who I quoted from, is a very interesting read too, because it goes over the subject very much that I've been talking about in colonial Australia, how the military developed there, and a more recent book by Alan Leake on Whirlpool. That's a few years old now, but that's pretty readily available. But that's the conclusion of the presentation, and thank you for all of your attention. I don't know, Ron, whether you want whether the questions are appropriate,
certainly.
because I'm quite happy to help out.
Got any questions,
yes,
please?
I lived and worked at Richmond for a number of years.
Yes.
And his name never ever came up locally.
No. It's only been more recently that it has, particularly with Leake's book, but as I said, it was uncomfortable, and the War Memorial didn't know how to deal with this particular period for whatever reason. So Whirlpool ended his time there. All of these places are well known today, McGrath's Hill and Windsor and Richmond, in the area that he ended up in by default, because his only real friend in life provided him with a hut there that he could live in and see out his final days. But it would have been interesting had he survived a bit more. I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have been at Victoria Barracks a year or so later, even if he was still alive when House got his Victoria Cross. Yeah.
Not a question, Rowan, but I was doing some research into World War I veterans from the Goulburn area, and by, you know how these things happen, I was told that the current site of the New South Wales Police Academy was originally allocated to Waterloo veterans as farmers. That didn't work out for them, but that piece of ground there near the river was allocated to Waterloo veterans.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting how many did get involved in the police force, just as Whirlpool did, and in the prison in service. I mean, it's a fairly auspicious position to be the governor of the jail at Berrima and Goulburn. These places were run by veterans.
Yeah, you could conceive that some of those guys would have been working in and around Goulburn Jail
Yeah.
and Berrima.
Yep.
Just a bit of trivia. The Army wasn't involved in the early colonial days till about 1791. It was all naval marines, so there were no Army personnel.
That's understood. Yeah. My main focus was, of course, the 19th century with later.
When Whirlpool took up current service in both in different military units and police forces, you think some of his colleagues would have sort of picked up by his bearing, dress and behaviour that his previous history?
Yeah, well, they did. That's how he was discovered in Hawthorne by one of the alert NCOs there, and that's how because he was not even looking for an award or anything, and then that came up, and then it was eventually sent out from Queen Victoria to the governor in Victoria to get it. So that's what eventually happened. But he later on, if he'd have disclosed his military background, some of those things that happened to him when for drunkenness and those sort of things would have been forgotten. And even when he had a bout at Wiseman's Ferry, but it was a very small community, and some fellow took up a grudge against him and got him sacked because of, it was on a weekend. He just got caught up at the local hotel there, but it didn't affect his employment at all. So, there was no compassion given to him in a number of those circumstances at all. And the parents wanted him to stay on. It was some local council or something that got him dismissed from that school.
Heard that before.
Well, thank you, Ron, for a very